Mary Cassatt holds a unique place in the history of American artists. She spent 60 years in France, and she was the only American to have exhibited with the Impressionists. Most of the Impressionists were focused on the beauty of landscapes, but Cassatt's love was portraits. She never married or had children, but her reputation was secured by her tender portrayal of the relationship between mother and child. Her eagerness to take on new challenges is a recurring theme in her career. This year is the 180th year of her birth, and commemorating that event are shows in Philadelphia and San Francisco. The paintings in this show, called Mary Cassatt at Work, are mostly her later paintings in pastels. Although the show is definitely worth a visit, it has a rather narrow scope. I'm going to show you the entire sweep of her career. I will be coming back to all the images in this introduction. Cassatt was born on May 22, 1844, in Allegheny City, now a part of Pittsburgh. That makes her 4 years younger than Claude Monet, and the first Impressionist, and 10 years younger than her mentor, Edgar Degas. She was 3 years younger than her friend and fellow Impressionist, the French artist Berthe Morisot. Cassatt was the fourth of 7 children, 2 of whom died in childbirth. Her father, Robert, descended from a French Huguenot family, hence the French-sounding name. He was a successful stockbroker and land speculator and was retired by the age of 42. We shall get to Cassatt's mother in a minute. Her oldest brother, Alexander, became the president of the Pennsylvania Railroad and one of the wealthiest men in America. Cassatt's parents considered travel to be an integral part of their children's education, and when Mary was still a young girl, she had already seen the great capitals of Europe. When she was 11, she was at the Paris World Fair, where she first saw the paintings of Corot, Delacroix, and Courbet, as well as Pissarro. Like Monet's parents, Cassatt's parents objected to her becoming a professional artist. Nevertheless, she enrolled in the Pennsylvania Academy of Fine Arts in Philadelphia when she was only 15. 20% of the students were female, but few were determined as Cassatt to make art their career. It was at this academy that she became an advocate for equal rights for both sexes. She was enrolled in that school for the duration of the American Civil War. Cassatt was impatient with the slow pace of instruction at the academy. Overcoming the objections of her father, she moved to Paris when she was 22. Women were not accepted at the Ecole Des Beaux Arts, so she enrolled at the studio of the highly regarded realist painter Jean-Léon Gérôme. The American artist Thomas Eakins was also enrolled in that studio. Her father would not pay for any of her painting supplies. She supplemented her studies with copying from the masters in the Louvre. The Louvre had opened in 1793 and was the greatest museum in the world. The Grand Gallery on the second floor, at over 1,300 feet long, was the longest room in the world. It was always filled with people. In Paris, it seemed that everyone cared about art. In 1870, Cassatt's painting, The Mandolin Player, was accepted by the Salon, that huge state-sponsored annual art show at the Palais des Champs-Élysées in Paris. To be accepted by the Salon was the ambition of most European artists at that time, and she was one of the first American women to be accepted. Cassatt was only 26. This painting is in the Romantic style of Corot and was quite typical of the academic painting of the period. Later that year, Cassatt moved back to Pennsylvania to live with her family in order to escape the horrors of the Franco-Prussian War. Even with her success at the Salon, her father continued to disapprove of her artistic ambitions, and he still refused to pay for her art supplies. She grew increasingly frustrated and considered giving up art. She wrote, "I have given up my studio and torn up my father's portrait, and I have not touched a brush for 6 weeks, nor ever will again until I see some prospect of getting back to Europe," unquote. These are the words of a passionate and determined young woman. Her prospects brightened when she received a commission which took her on a paid trip to Parma, Italy. She set off for Europe again with a fellow artist, Émilie Sartain, from Philadelphia. Quote, "Oh, how wild I am to get back to work. My fingers fairly itch and my eyes water to see a fine picture again." While she was in Parma, Cassatt painted this beautiful piece, two women throwing flowers at the carnival, and it was accepted for the Salon of 1872. Quote, "All Parma is talking about Miss Cassatt and her picture, and everyone is anxious to know her." Unquote. This is so different than the first painting accepted by the Salon shown on the right, which seems very tentative by comparison. This composition is bold, pressing all of the edges of the canvas with beautifully rendered faces and hands at unusual angles. The glowing reviews Cassatt received gave her renewed confidence that she could succeed as an artist. From Parma, Cassatt traveled to Madrid and Seville. Spain had been her intended destination when she went back to Europe. She joked, "I really feel as if it was intended that I should be a Spaniard, and quite a mistake that I was born in America." This romantic piece was accepted for the 1873 Salon. The beautiful Spanish maiden flirtatiously offers a glass of water to a bullfighter who dips panal, Spanish for honeycomb, into it to make an energizing drink. Cassatt's gamble on the Spanish subject paid off. This Salon picture was soon sold to a Paris collector. Again, it is a bold composition with the bullfighter's head at an unusual angle and his silver-adorned vest carefully rendered, his red cape wrapped around his waist. Notice her right hand bent back against her waist and her left hand seen through the water glass. From Spain, she traveled to Holland and Belgium to study Rubens, and then down to Rome for the winter. By 1874, she was headed back to Paris to share an apartment with her older sister Lydia, who was also unmarried. With over 1 million men killed in the Civil War, it was not unusual for American women to remain single. Cassatt also believed that to be a professional artist, she would not have time for a family. At the same time, her parents moved to Paris, and they ultimately lived together with their 2 daughters in a large apartment. She was close to her worldly mother and her businesslike father, and she found her sister Lydia to be a pleasant, elegant companion. She welcomed them as a true addition to her life, and her family enjoyed Cassatt's artistic world. By then, her father had softened about Cassatt's chosen career path. Some speculate that she never married or had children because she came from such a large family herself. In 1875, Cassatt saw the pastels of Edgar Degas in a gallery window. She said later, "The first sight of Degas' pictures was the turning point in my artistic life." Unquote. She had been growing increasingly frustrated with and contemptuous of the Salon jury system. In 1877, both her entries had been rejected, and for the first time in 7 years, she was not represented at the Salon. Speaking of Degas, quote, "I used to go and flatten my nose against the window of his gallery and absorb all I could of his art." Unquote. What is so appealing about this image? The composition is unusual, with figures going off the edges on 3 sides. The figures are in casual positions, with one ballerina leaning over to adjust her slipper. The muted colors of the pastels are wonderful. Degas had seen and admired Cassatt's work as well, and in 1877 he invited her to join the Impressionists, who had been mounting their own show since 1874 in competition with the Salon. They already had one female member, Berthe Morisot, who became Cassatt's friend and colleague. Degas, 10 years older than Cassatt, became her mentor, teacher, and close friend. This bond was made easier because his mother was American, he had numerous American relatives, and he had recently traveled to New York and New Orleans. They shared similar tastes in art and literature, both came from affluent backgrounds, and had studied painting in Italy, and both were independent, never marrying. The sophisticated and well-dressed Degas, then 45, was a welcome dinner guest at the Cassatt residence. Degas' theme of the theater and his techniques of pastel, gouache, and printmaking were eagerly taken up by Cassatt. She was instrumental in helping Degas sell his paintings and promoting his reputation in America. At her urging, this pastel by Degas was acquired by her wealthy friend Louisine Elder and lent to an exhibit in New York in 1878. It may have been the first Impressionist painting to be shown in the U.S. In 1874, the first annual show of the artists who had declared their independence from the Salon was known by the awkward name of the Société Anonyme des Artistes Peintres, Sculpteurs, Graveurs, etc. When Monet exhibited this painting, which he called Impression Sunrise, in that show it was very controversial. It was panned by most of the critics, one of whom, Louis Leroy, coined the word Impressionism as a derogatory term to describe Monet and his friends. Until then, the word Impressionism could not be found in any dictionary. Henry Bacon, a friend of Cassatt's, thought that the Impressionists were so radical that they were, quote, afflicted with some hitherto unknown disease of the eye. When Cassatt was invited to join the Impressionists, she was 33, and the timing was perfect. She was suddenly freed from the academic subjects, the somber colors, and the tight brushstrokes of the Salon. Quote, finally, I could work with absolute independence, without concern for the eventual opinion of the jury. I detested conventional art, and I began to live. This beautiful portrait of her sister Lydia, painted in 1877, the year she was invited into the Impressionist group, shows a new freedom in her brushwork. Look at the white and the blue of the sleeve on her dress, and the looseness of the girl's hair. This painting was contributed to the Philadelphia-San Francisco show by Alice Walton's Crystal Bridges Museum in Bentonville, Arkansas. This amazing museum, designed by Moshe Safdie, is definitely worth a special detour. Cassatt had risked her academic reputation by exploring the techniques and philosophy of modernism as expressed by the Impressionists, and some critics were not happy. One New York Times critic wrote, I feel sorry for Mary Cassatt. She's a Philadelphian, and she has her place in the Salon. A great triumph for a woman and a foreigner. But why has she thus gone astray? Cassatt, like Degas and Monet, preferred the term independent artist to impressionist. But even that drew criticism. Quote, independent of what? We should like to know. Of criticism? Of purchasers? Of all ideas of perspective and of color? We pause for a reply. Unquote. In hindsight, it is hard to believe that they could be talking about a painting like this beautiful and charming piece of the little girl in the blue armchair. This is possibly Cassatt's most famous painting, and it was among the 10 paintings she showed at the 1879 Impressionist show, which was her first. Cassatt's young subject is sprawling in a large turquoise armchair, her plaid skirt pulled up around her waist to reveal her lacy pantaloons. The smartly dressed little girl fidgets. In the next chair is her sleeping dog. The girl's pose has the naturalism of childhood that characterizes so many of Cassatt's paintings of children. Look at the looseness with which she has captured the blue chintz of the chairs. Under Degas' guidance, she had begun to collect and study Japanese prints. Their patterns and their asymmetric designs greatly influenced her work. Here, she's placed the girl, the focus of the composition, off-center. The armchairs form a pattern surrounding an oddly shaped negative space in the middle of the picture. Negative space is the space left over and can be interesting in its own right. Always up for the challenge of a new artistic medium, in this self-portrait she is experimenting with gouache, which is an opaque watercolor. The colors are bright and the brush strokes loose. Of course, the Salon would never have accepted a canvas which seemed to be so unfinished. Cassatt was always current with the latest fashion in Paris hats. It's interesting to compare Degas' portrait of Cassatt with her own. Degas' colors were often more somber than Cassatt's. The pose has her leaning forward, holding a bunch of photos, possibly of painting reproductions, and a less flamboyant version of the same hat. They both have the same loose brush work so typical of the Impressionists. According to Degas, Cassatt was a woman who was in Paris but not of Paris. A fair statement, but she was very sociable, went to the theater often, and mixed well with the artistic society of Paris. Artists, Critics, collectors, and dealers were all of interest to her, and her facility with the French language made it possible for her to have both American and French friends. But Cassatt would always be an ambitious American who saw no boundaries. Under Degas' influence, Cassatt did a number of paintings of the opera, and she developed a habit of taking a sketchbook with her to the theater. This one has the same earth tones as Degas. It's during an intermission where the lights are up. The woman in a somber black hat and dress is looking across the hall through her glasses at another opera lover, while a man in the upper row is looking at her through his opera glasses. This one is a dramatic and intimate close-up, a bold composition, with the obligatory fan now open. The dresses are much more formal, with bare shoulders and white kid gloves. Now the performance has started, and the bright light of the stage is illuminating lots of bare skin. The opera glasses are now trained on the performance. The two profiles are in contrast, one in shadow, the other in full light. This beautiful piece looks more like a commissioned portrait, probably of two sisters. It's much more tightly painted. The bouquet of flowers would seem to indicate this evening is a special occasion to be commemorated. Reflected in a large mirror behind them, a glittering chandelier illuminates the tiers of gilded balconies that curve majestically around the theater. Aware that they are on view from the other boxes, the young women appear slightly self-conscious. One of the young women hides behind her fan, the other clutches her bouquet. Her carefully neutral expression establishes a discreet emotional distance. The small black ribbon around her neck, similar to the ones worn by the ballerinas, offsets the softly blended colors of her dress and her throat. Degas had discovered the advantages of selling multiple prints of the same drawing, and Cassatt was eager to learn the art of intaglio printing from him. Her studio was very close to his, and he owned a printing press. Here is a Cassatt print of her favorite opera subject using a combination of techniques. She would become a master printmaker. Intaglio is the kind of printing I learned at Williams College and what I continued with at the Ecole des Beaux Arts in Paris the following year, so I want to take a few minutes to explain it. Intaglio, meaning carving or engraving in Italian, was developed in Germany in the early 15th century as a much easier and more immediate form of printing than relief printing, which we will talk about later. There are various ways of making a line on a soft metal plate, usually copper. From left to right, it can be engraved with a very hard, sharp instrument. It can be scratched for a dry point line which leaves a metal burr, or it can be etched with a line drawn through an acid-resistant resin which has been onto the plate, which is then placed in an acid bath. And finally, a tone called an aquatint can be created with a resin stipple. A number of these techniques can be used together on the same plate. Then the entire plate is covered with ink. Next, the face of the plate is wiped clean with cheesecloth, leaving only the ink which is in the depressions or caught in a burr. Finally, a damp paper is placed on the plate and run through a press, so that the ink in the grooves is transferred to the paper. Here is a Degas print of his new friend Cassatt studying a painting at the Louvre. Her sister Lydia sits next to her with her nose in a guidebook. They are dressed in their Sunday best. It is mostly aquatint or stippled tones without much line. And here is Cassatt's copy of that image on the right. Her figure is reversed, as it is a print of the Degas image, and curiously she has overlapped a seating figure which is not reversed. Cassatt has used more etched line than aquatint, giving the black dresses a deeper and richer tone. Copper plates were very expensive, and the unusual shape of this print probably meant that it was a piece of leftover copper. Back to Cassatt's paintings. This is Cassatt's portrait of her mother, Catherine, who came from a banking family, who was well educated and well read, and she had a profound influence on her daughter Mary. She believed in educating women to be knowledgeable and socially active. She is reading the French newspaper Le Figaro, so we know that she is at least bilingual. We see the reflection of her right hand in a mirror. Cassatt often used mirrors to expand the space, and although she did not explicitly make political statements about women's rights in her paintings, her artistic portrayal of women was consistently done with the dignity and suggestion of a meaningful inner life. Cassatt objected to being stereotyped as a woman artist and aspired to be a professional rather than a woman who paints. In the early 20th century, she supported the women's suffrage movement. She and Degas were diametrically opposed when it came to politics and women's rights. This bold bouquet of lilacs in a window is one of her few still lifes, but I include it here because I find it to be quite striking. The soft color scheme of peaches and lavenders and whites is one which she favored. The delicate flowers which fill up most of the canvas are set off by the angled hard edges of the green window, which is propped open with a metal brace to catch the cool summer breezes. The ivy on the side of the building is growing up over the brace, suggesting that this window is open most of the time. Maybe the bouquet is in a greenhouse. The small brushstrokes and the loose, heavy pigment is so typical of many of her fellow Impressionists. Taking afternoon tea was a social ritual for many upper-middle-class women, and Cassatt was now committed to portraying the ordinary events of everyday life. Her model for this canvas was her sister Lydia, who often posed for her. The color scheme is similar to the one we just saw, with the peaches and whites and lilac shadows. The French critics were more receptive to Cassatt than the American critics. One wrote, quote, "Monsieur Degas and Mademoiselle Cassatt are perhaps the only artists who distinguish themselves in this group of Impressionists. Both have a lively sense of the fragmented lighting in Paris apartments. Both find unique nuances of color to render the flesh tints of women fatigued in late nights and the rustling lightness of worldly fashions. Notice the beautiful warm reflected light on her white kid glove and on the bottom of her nose, and the gold highlight on the edge of the cup, and the foreshortened silver spoon on the saucer. I also love the rendering of the white orchids and the contrast between the black stripes of the chair and the soft pink dress." Cassatt showed this painting to critical acclaim in the 1881 Impressionist show. Lydia died suddenly in 1882 when Mary was 38, and this was a big emotional setback for her. She stopped painting for several months. She never found another companion to replace her sister. This painting is the second of two portraits Cassatt painted of Mary Ellison, who was a friend of Louisine Elder, whom I have mentioned earlier. Louisine later became Mrs. H.O. Havermeyer, and with Cassatt's help, she amassed an important Impressionist collection, which she later gave to the Metropolitan Museum in New York. Here Cassatt concentrates on Miss Ellison's contemplative mood. I love the red accents. In Young Girl at a Window, we see the subject seated in a wicker armchair at an angle to the picture plane. She is in a beautiful white dress and hat with beige leather gloves, as if having just returned from a social gathering. She seems wrapped in reverie with an impression possibly tinged with sadness, as she absent-mindedly pets her dog, who is concentrating on something in the street below. The light filters through the hat to illuminate her beautiful, warm face. Cassatt adds a hint of the Paris skyline in the distance. This painting of her brother Alexander and his son Robert is quite fascinating. As I mentioned earlier, Alexander was the chairman of the Pennsylvania Railroad and had become one of the wealthiest men in America. He looks like he has been out in the sun with a hat on, as his forehead is quite pale. His dark suit blends with his son's to become an interesting, continuous black shape, punctuated by his son's white collar. Their identically brown hair blends together as well. Even though he has a newspaper in his lap, they both stare into space as if bored with their modeling duties. Robert's hand is around his father's shoulder, physically bonding with him, like the mother-child bond we shall see in a minute. Like Lydia, Cassatt's brother Alec was a willing sitter who did a portrait of him almost every time he came to Paris, which was often. Girl arranging her hair was greatly admired in the eighth and last Impressionist show held in 1886. However, no one praised the painting more highly than Edgar Degas, who acquired the work for his own collection. Cassatt's theme is one that Degas himself often portrayed, a woman's toilette. After Degas' death, this painting was even briefly attributed to him. Cassatt deliberately chose a plain adolescent as her subject so that appreciation of the painting would not depend on the beauty of the model. Dressed in a loose chemise and seated before a washstand and mirror, she performs the routine task of coiling her hair. The girl's pose is awkward but natural, giving a grace and rhythm to the composition, and the S curve formed by her arms and the twist of her hair creates a lovely, fluid motion. Recalling the lessons of the past when she composed this painting, Cassatt looked back to the Renaissance for her inspiration. To show the natural beauty of the young girl's gesture, Cassatt adopted the uplifted, bent arm and turned head of Michelangelo's sculpture, The Dying Slave. Cassatt often painted the theme of a little girl wearing an oversized hat in a pose similar to this one. However, this child's serious expression sets the painting apart. Most of the girls appear to be willing and happy models. They smile and wear elaborate bonnets and frilly dresses. In this one, the little girl wears a plain gray pinafore and a large, simple straw hat. Her furrowed brow and protruding upper lip suggest that she is not happy. Maybe she was taken away from her friends in order to pose. Cassatt beautifully portrays the frustrations of childhood. In 1886, the year she painted this child, Cassatt provided 2 paintings for the first Impressionist exhibit in the U.S., organized by the art dealer Paul Durin-Rouet. He greatly admired her work and exhibited it a total of 37 times in his Paris and New York galleries. He ultimately bought almost 400 of her paintings and prints. Cassatt brought her wealthy American friends to his galleries, and the 2 of them, as a team, played a major role in the acquisition of Impressionist paintings as well as old masters by the museums and private collectors of the U.S. Cassatt had a great respect for the paintings of Edward Manet. Like Manet, Portrait of an Elderly Lady has large dark areas of black and warm flesh tones applied with the broad brushstrokes. Although the identity of the sitter is not known, she appears in other works by Cassatt. She paints this woman with a characteristic candor, including gray hair and wrinkles, sitting on a chintz-upholstered chair with her arms slung across the top. Her casual pose exudes self-confidence. The large pink rose in her bonnet is a beautiful symbol that offsets the dark dress. Possibly because of her fondness for her 3 nephews and 4 nieces, or because of her friendship with Pissarro, who painted many portraits of his family, in the late 1880s, Cassatt settled into the theme of the mother and child. It was an immediate critical success. This was an acceptable subject for a woman artist, but it also touched on the hearts of women and men who cherished the bond they had with their own children. In this one, called simply Mother and Child, Cassatt has lovingly captured that moment when the sleepy child absent-mindedly grips her mother's chin, her thoughts already in dreamland. Notice the interesting connection between the child's right hand and the mother's interlocked hands and the child's leg. I also love the rich coloration of the mother's flower print dress and the loose, impressionistic treatment of the background. From Degas' influence, Cassatt took up and mastered the medium of pastel, or sticks of colored chalk with an oil binder. Here, in another of her mother-child series, the unhappy child reaches out to someone else in the room, possibly a sibling, as her mother affectionately presses her cheek against the child's forehead. There's a lovely sculptural sequence starting with the child's bare foot, her leg, her hand, her mother's right hand gripping the sock, and her left leg, and finally her mother's other hand. Cassatt was so skilled at flesh tones. It's ironic that Cassatt never married and never had a child of her own, and that the child in the painting, or in this case the pastel, rarely belonged to the woman who was holding her. These mother-child portraits were very carefully staged by Cassatt, with paid models and the infants of her friends, but they show that she had a great sympathy and understanding of that tender mother-child relationship which has been portrayed over the centuries. The happiness on the child's face as she plays patty cake is really lovely. Notice the richness of the pastel colors and the skillful rendering of the poofy shoulders of the dress. At the same time, Cassatt was attracted to dry point. As I mentioned, dry point leaves a burr on the copper plate, making it impossible to wipe the plate off cleanly. The resulting printed line is softer than an etched line. This is a similar pose with a little more detachment between mother and child. The image is reversed because it's a print. Cassatt decided to do a series of 12 different dry points, and a set of them was bought by the French government. These were the first of her works to enter a public collection. Here is another pair of mother-child pastels and dry points with subtly different poses. It's apparent that the pastel came first. The dry point child has his arm around his mother, and the dry point mother is looking at the child who looks away. Both changes are nice refinements. The right arm of the mother in the pastel is distracting to the composition. The subtlety of the line quality in the dry point is really superb, and yet the skin tones in the pastel are also lovely. Dry point was not a popular medium at the time, requiring a great deal of patience to be able to control the diamond-tipped needle that one dragged over the copper plate as if it were a fine pen on paper. The success of this series established Cassatt as one of the top printmakers of her day. This one was probably inspired by her niece, Catherine, whose portrait she had painted at about the same time. The intense gazes of the two girls suggest an exploration of the map of the world as they talk together. The title of the dry point, The Map, is the necessary clue to what they are studying. As we have seen, hats in Paris at the end of the 19th century were a major fashion statement. Here we see a young woman trying to decide if this hat is the right one for her ensemble. This is a serious business, and she does not look happy. She could easily change her mind about her choice. The contrast between the faint lines of her hands and the deep richness of the lines of the bouquet is quite wonderful. This series led to her next major set of prints, which she exhibited in 1891 in her first solo exhibition in the Durand-Rouet Gallery in Paris. In the 1880s, Cassatt's reputation went from being the daring newcomer to Impressionism to being a painter of the modern Madonna. And although she continued to explore other themes, she capitalized on her success by delving deeply into this idea, like Monet and his water lilies. Her maternités, or motherhoods, became so highly regarded internationally that they were the first ones to be collected by museums. Of course, this subject had been painted many times before, but there was something about the unassuming and understated naturalism of her poses which made them stand out. The baby's head is resting on his left arm, dramatically foreshortened, and his hand connects with the oval of the chair back, pulling the composition together in a pleasing way. The idle stare of the young boy seems so childlike. The intersection of the mother's left hand with the son's right leg and arm is so convincing. I love this one as well. The young mother clutches her baby with its fat pink cheeks pressed to hers in an expression of such intimacy. This canvas seems unfinished with so much of bare canvas showing and the bold, confident lines of the underpainting left exposed. This seemingly unfinished artwork was a new direction in painting which was being explored on both sides of the Atlantic. For some reason, the use of photography by artists in the late 19th century is a touchy subject, some thinking that it's like a cheat. Yet how could Cassatt have possibly captured a squirming child without the aid of a camera? The Kodak camera, introduced by George Eastman in the mid-1880s, was the first personal camera to be available. Of course, the photos were in black and white, and Cassatt's rendering of skin tones is so beautiful. This touching pastel was quickly acquired by the great Impressionist collector Henri Rouart. Again, the pink-cheeked baby is pressed tightly to his mother's cheek. Behind them is a lovely abstraction of the picture in a bowl and the reflection of the back of her head in a mirror. The warm left hand of the mother clutching the baby's bottom is so beautifully rendered. In 1890, Cassatt attended a major exhibition of Japanese prints in Paris with the art critic Philippe Berthe. When he pointed color and line of the woodblock prints, he declared, "No European could have done that." This was just the kind of challenge which Cassatt loved. But first we need to understand woodblock or relief printing. Relief printing was first used by the Egyptians to print fabric over 3,000 years ago. Everything which is not to be printed is cut away. This traditionally was done on the end grain of a hardwood block. It was easily adaptable to the printing press, which was developed in the 16th century. The woodblock illustration could be set with other type and ink rolled on the entire assembly all at once. The ink is on the surface, not in the cracks, as with intaglio printing. In the 19th century, the Japanese had developed relief printing to a high art, with extremely fine wood carving and multiple blocks perfectly registered to produce a beautiful image in many colors. Hokusai's print of the Great Wave with Mount Fuji in the background was one of the most famous. There is no horizon showing. Two large boats are caught up in the gigantic waves, which break with the intricacy of a fractal. It is important to remember that all of the white in this image has been cut away, and at least 7 separate blocks, perfectly registered, were required for this print. Cassatt was determined to create the same effect with intaglio printing, and what she achieved was a fascinating hybrid. She started with a beautifully rendered dry point, and then added successive aquatint plates, each one carefully registered for each different color. As before, she did other studies like the pastel on the right, which is full of rich, beautiful warm tones, in contrast with the cool ones of the print. In the print, the baby's right hand is no longer by his side, but touching his mother's face. This print of a bare-torsoed woman leaning over a washbowl is a powerful composition. The simple blue wall and ochre washstand are offset by the striped robe and the patterned carpet. We see the top of her head in the mirror over the washstand. It is almost as if the model is leaning over so that her complete figure will be included in the picture. Cassatt tried this print with various color schemes. When Degas saw Cassatt's simple lines capturing the model's back and left arm, he exclaimed, "I do not admit that a woman could draw like that." Although they were close friends, his views of women were very conservative, and as I mentioned, politically they were far apart. Cassatt painted the boating party in the winter at Antibes on the Mediterranean coast of France. Critics feel that this is representative of Cassatt's finest period. Just 2 years earlier, as a mature and accomplished artist, she had had her first one-person exhibition in which her unusual series of 10-color prints were shown at the Durand-Rouet Gallery in Paris, followed by another show in his New York gallery. In this piece, the high horizon, the off-center placement of figures, the elimination of unnecessary detail, and the preoccupation with the surface patterns and contours were all influenced by the Japanese woodcuts. For the picture's subject matter, Cassatt may have drawn upon Edward Manet's painting called Boating, which she greatly admired. Like Manet, who himself admired Japanese woodcuts, she used a close-up view with the nearest portion of the boat cut off at the edge of the image. But her dazzling color scheme is more like the color preferences of Gauguin and Van Gogh. Notice the boatman's foot braced on one of the cross pieces of the lime green boat. The blue water creates lots of interesting negative spaces in Cassatt's paintings. The composition of this painting is unconventional and striking. The darkly clad figure of the boatman looms large in the foreground, almost appearing to project out of the canvas. The sail at the left oar and the bow of the boat all point to the head of the child, who, in a pose typical of Cassatt, is shown sprawled graciously yet naturally in his mother's lap. Despite the simple subject and the centrality of the contented baby, the painting has a particular psychological intensity because of the relationship between the figures, which are so closely tied together in this composition. Notice that the baby is staring at the boatman. Much larger than most of Cassatt's paintings, this is certainly one of her most ambitious pieces. Although Alexander was Mary's favorite brother, Jenny, the wife of her brother Joseph, was her favorite sister-in-law, and Jenny, here with her young son Joseph, was always a willing model. I particularly like the worried expression on Joseph's face as he is reluctantly clutched to his mother's breast. She seems to be preoccupied. The calm blue water in the background is a nice foil for the loose brushwork in the faces in the dress. I also like the stripes on the right sleeve. I love this pastel, which depicts a classic interaction between women, the admiring of someone else's child, who in this case is very receptive to the stranger's affectionate handholds. I shall never forget the time I was holding my infant son, and a female acquaintance came up to me and exclaimed, "Can I hold your baby?" Cassatt is masterful at portraying foreshortened faces, as she has here with the mother, and that complicated piece of anatomy, the hand. There is no doubt that Cassatt's treatment of the mother and child theme with its echoes of past traditions was responsible for her lasting fame as an artist, but this decision was fraught with gender issues from the beginning, and they are still being debated today. Cassatt and her sister artists fought to be judged in a gender-neutral way, but the public's subjective response to a female artist treating this maternal theme was hard to overcome. This beautiful pastel is another touching mother-child interaction, with her warm cheeks touching the child encircled in her mother's left arm. And finally, I find this mother-daughter painting to be particularly appealing. The models may have been neighbors of Cassatt's near her country home outside of Paris. She often asked local women to sit for her, feeling that professional models posed too self-consciously. For the sittings, Cassatt dressed the women in gowns which she had bought from well-known Paris clothiers. As in most of her paintings, Cassatt does not glamorize or sentimentalize her subjects. Instead, she presents them as wholesome, attractive individuals. Here, the young girl in her lap is wanting attention as she glances at us, while her mother, not to be distracted, continues with her sewing. When Cassatt painted this piece, she was at the height of her artistic success. She drew on her many years of experience, working with ease and assurance. The sun is flooding into the artist's studio on a summer's day, and Cassatt contrasts the crisp black and white stripes on her model's shoulders with the softness of the dress she is mending. Note the highlight on the mother's nose. I will finish with Cassatt's monumental mural for the 1893 Chicago World's Fair. In 1891, Chicago businesswoman Berthe Palmer approached Cassatt to paint a 12-foot by 58-foot mural about modern women for the Women's Building for the Columbian Exposition to be held in Chicago in 1893. This was to be a pavilion by and for women, with a woman architect and a woman painters and sculptors. At first, Cassatt was reluctant to take on this very large commission. Cassatt completed the project in 2 years when she was 49, while living in her country chateau in Berthe, north of Paris. The left panel is young girls pursuing fame, and the central panel is young women plucking the fruits of knowledge and science. The right panel is art, music, and dancing, with a woman playing the banjo, which had become a popular instrument at the time. The mural displays a community of women apart from their relation to men, as accomplished persons in their own right. Palmer considered Cassatt to be an American treasure and the best person to focus the world's attention on the status of women. 27 million people attended the fair. Tragically, although the mural was carefully taken down before the building was demolished when the fair ended, it was never exhibited after the fair closed, and it has been lost. However, Cassatt made several studies and paintings on the theme similar to those in the mural, and many people visited her chateau to see the murals in process. Here are two women, one reaching to pick a piece of fruit, the other sitting meditatively holding a pear in her lap. According to Cassatt, the pear tree represents the tree of knowledge, and in plucking its fruit, these women express their desire for equality and intellectual recognition. The women are both dressed in the loose-fitting, quote-unquote, aesthetic dress, which had come into fashion among modern women. It did not require a corset. And finally, we have a beautiful depiction of a mother-daughter music lesson on the banjo. This scene was in the right side of the triptych, although the daughter was deleted for the mural. In this unusual print, Cassatt combines dry point, colored aquatint, and now monoprint, which is the direct painting of ink on a plate before it is run through the press. This made each print unique. The face of the daughter peering over the mother's shoulder is dry point, the pale skirts are aquatint, and the sleeves are monoprint. The combination is rich indeed. In 1904, France awarded Cassatt the coveted Légion d'honneur. Shortly after that, her eyesight began to fail, and in 1914, after several unsuccessful cataract operations, she was forced to give up painting completely. During the Great War, she spent some time in Grasse in southern France, away from the combat zone, but after the war, she went back to her beloved chateau in Berthe. She died of natural causes in June of 1926 at age 82. Monet died 6 months later at 86. She was one of the last of her generation who had come to Paris in the 1860s. She was the only American to exhibit with the Impressionists, and because she was a woman, her story is all the more remarkable. After her death, there were 7 retrospectives in the U.S. and Paris. I graduated from Williams in 1964 with a degree in art history, when it was a men's college. There were no women teachers, and we did not study a single female artist. Of course, I knew of Mary Cassatt, but this journey through her life and her art has been a wonderful voyage of discovery for me. As Berthe Palmer said, Mary Cassatt is indeed an American treasure. Thank you for watching. How about a few questions?